Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is sitting in a doctor's office, describing thoughts they've never told anyone out loud. They're going to get a diagnosis, a name for what's happening inside them, maybe a prescription, maybe a referral, the whole system around them, the terminology, the treatment. The idea that what they're experiencing is medical and not moral is something humans spent an extraordinarily long time building. For most of history, none of that existed. No diagnosis, no terminology, no framework that separated the suffering of the mind from the punishment of the gods. If your thoughts were disordered, if you heard things others couldn't hear, if you couldn't make yourself get up off the ground for weeks at a time, the world around you had one primary explanation. Something had entered you. Something needed to come out. And what humans did next, for tens of thousands of years, is one of the strangest, most desperate, and surprisingly compassionate stories in our entire history. Let's go back to the beginning. The oldest evidence we have for how ancient humans treated mental illness comes not from a text or a temple, but from a skull. Several skulls, actually, found across multiple continents, dating back as far as 10,000 years. Each one has a hole in it, not a wound. A deliberate, carefully made opening, bored through living bone with stone tools. And the edges of those holes had healed, which means the patient survived, which means someone performed the procedure, watched the person recover, and considered it a success worth repeating. This practice is called trepanation, and it is the oldest surgical procedure in recorded human history. The dominant theory for why they did it is not physical injury. Most of the skulls show no signs of trauma that would require it. The leading explanation is that they were releasing something. A spirit, a demon, a force that had taken up residence inside the head and was expressing itself as madness, seizure, or behavior that couldn't be explained any other way. They were wrong about the mechanism, but they were right that something was happening inside the skull, and they refused to do nothing about it. That impulse, the refusal to watch someone suffer without attempting an intervention, is the thread that runs through every era of this story. Because here is what almost every ancient culture agreed on, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Mental illness was not random, it was caused. Something external had entered the person, or something internal had been disturbed, or a powerful force had decided to make an example of them. The specific cosmology changed depending on where you were born, but the structure of the belief was nearly universal. In ancient Mesopotamia, around 2000 BCE, Babylonian physicians kept detailed clay tablet records of mental symptoms they observed. Patients who couldn't sleep, who spoke to people who weren't there, who had violent episodes with no apparent trigger, who became catatonic for days at a time. They had names for these conditions. They had treatment protocols, and every single one of those protocols began with the same assumption. The patient had been possessed by a specific demon, and the demon had a name, and the name mattered because you couldn't expel something without knowing what it was. Priests called ashipu were trained to diagnose which demon was responsible based on the specific pattern of symptoms. Then, a healer called an ASU would administer physical treatments, herbal preparations, specific foods, rituals performed at precise times. The two worked together. The spiritual diagnosis and the physical intervention were not considered separate approaches. They were the same treatment delivered through different channels, and some of those herbal preparations we now know contained compounds with genuine psychoactive properties. They were doing something to the brain. They just explained it differently. Ancient Egypt ran a parallel system. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents ever found, dating to around 1550 BCE, contains descriptions of what we would now recognize as depression, dementia, and what sounds remarkably like hysteria. Egyptian physicians attributed these conditions to a wandering uterus in women, or to the heart, which they considered the seat of both emotion and intellect, becoming flooded with darkness. Treatment involved incantations, physical remedies, and rituals designed to restore the balance between the patient and the divine order of the universe. But here's the detail that tends to get overlooked. Egypt also had dedicated healing temples. Patients with persistent mental disturbance were brought to these temples not to be punished or hidden away, but to sleep inside the sacred space, in a practice called incubation, in the hope that the gods would send healing dreams. Priests would interpret those dreams and adjust the treatment accordingly. The patient was cared for, fed, watched over. The Egyptian instinct, even operating within a supernatural framework, was not to abandon the mentally ill. It was to surround them with structure and attention and the belief that recovery was possible. Greece took the story somewhere new. Around 400 BCE, a physician on the island of Kos began doing something radical. He started writing down his observations without invoking the gods to explain them. Hippocrates argued, in terms that scandalized many of his contemporaries, that mental illness was not possession, not divine punishment, not a spiritual crisis. It was a medical condition. It originated in the brain. It had physical causes, and it could, in principle, be treated with physical interventions. He described melancholia, what we would now call depression, as an excess of black bile disrupting the brain's function. He described mania. He described what sounds like postpartum psychosis. He was wrong about the mechanism. The four humors theory has not aged well, but the framework he introduced changed everything. For the first time in recorded history, a widely influential voice was saying that a disturbed mind was a sick body, not a corrupted soul. Not everyone agreed. Greek society held both ideas simultaneously, the medical and the supernatural, without apparent discomfort. The philosopher Plato believed certain forms of madness were divine gifts. The oracle at Delphi, whose pronouncements shaped the fate of empires, was considered to be in a state of sacred madness when she prophesied. Some forms of mental disturbance were pathology. Others were access to something beyond ordinary human perception. The line between the two was negotiated case by case. Rome inherited the Greek medical tradition and added something of its own. A physician named Galen, working in the 2nd century CE, expanded on Hippocrates and built a systematic theory of mental illness that would dominate European medicine for over 1,000 years. But Rome also developed something with darker implications: the idea that some mentally ill individuals were dangerous and needed to be controlled. The first recorded instances of what we would now call institutionalization appear in Roman records, not hospitals in any modern sense, but designated spaces where individuals who could not function or were considered threats were kept separate from the general population. Containment had entered the picture, and once it entered, it never fully left. When Rome fell and Europe moved into the medieval period, the Church became the primary interpreter of mental suffering, and the Church's framework was unambiguous. Mental disturbance was spiritual in origin. It was either divine trial, demonic possession, or the consequence of sin. The treatments that followed from this framework ranged from genuinely compassionate to catastrophic. On the compassionate end, monastic communities across Europe provided care for individuals who could not care for themselves. Monks and nuns fed, housed, and watched over people with severe mental illness, operating from a theology that demanded mercy toward the suffering. Some monasteries developed reputations across entire regions as places where the mentally disturbed could find shelter and basic care. On the other end was exorcism: brutal, prolonged, sometimes fatal attempts to drive out whatever had taken up residence. Fasting forced on patients until the demon, it was believed, could no longer sustain itself. Physical pain deliberately inflicted on the theory that the demon would find the body too uncomfortable to occupy. And in the worst cases, accusations of witchcraft leveled at individuals whose symptoms, hallucinations, erratic behavior, apparent detachment from shared reality, mapped onto the period's definition of someone who had made a pact with evil. The mentally ill were not always the accused in witch trials, but the overlap was real, documented, and deadly. Then came Bethlehem. Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, founded in 1247, became the most famous psychiatric institution in Western history, and not for reasons anyone should be proud of. By the 1400s, it had become a place of confinement for London's most severely mentally ill, and by the 1600s, it had become something else entirely. Members of the public paid a penny to walk through the wards and observe the patients. Bethlehem, corrupted over time into the word Bedlam, became a form of entertainment, The suffering of people with severe mental illness was a spectacle that Londoners visited on weekends for leisure. That word, bedlam, meaning chaos and madness, is still in the English language. It came from a hospital. But even in the darkest periods of this story, there were interruptions. Places and moments where the treatment of mental illness took a direction that looks, from our current position, almost shockingly modern. In 8th century Baghdad, the Islamic physician Rhazes designed what may be the first dedicated psychiatric ward in a hospital. Patients with mental illness were housed separately, given structured care, and treated with a combination of physical medicine and what Rhazes explicitly called conversation and emotional support. He believed that the relationship between healer and patient, the quality of attention and trust between them, was itself a form of medicine. He was describing, in the language of medieval Islamic medicine, something that would not be formalized in Western psychology for another 1,000 years. In 15th century Valencia, Spain, a hospital called the Hospital dels Innocents was founded specifically for the mentally ill. Patients were given work, structured routines, and social engagement. The approach was based on the theory that occupation and community connection were therapeutic in themselves. Modern psychiatric rehabilitation uses the same framework today. They were running it in 1410. The 18th century brought what historians call the Great Confinement. Across Europe, workhouses, hospitals, and institutions began filling with anyone who couldn't contribute economically. The mentally ill, the poor, the physically disabled, all housed together, all managed through the logic of containment rather than care. Then, in 1793, a French physician named Philippe Pinel walked into the Bicêtre Asylum in Paris and did something that became one of the most debated acts in the history of psychiatry. He ordered the chains removed from the patients. He interviewed them. He documented their histories. He began treating them as people whose condition had comprehensible causes, rather than as animals to be managed through restraint. His patient notes, still preserved, read like the beginning of something genuinely new. This is a person. This is what happened to them. This is what I tried. It wasn't a clean revolution. Institutions remained brutal in many places for another century and beyond. The history of psychiatry through the 19th and 20th centuries contains chapters that are difficult to read, experimental treatments that caused serious harm, systems that prioritized containment over care in ways that echo the darkest medieval approaches. But the direction had shifted, slowly, unevenly, with enormous resistance at every stage. Here is the full arc of it. 10,000 years ago, someone drilled a hole in a living skull because they refused to watch a person suffer without trying something. 4,000 years ago, Babylonian priests were cataloging symptoms and matching them to treatments with a precision that looks, in structure, if not in content, surprisingly like diagnostic medicine. 2,400 years ago, a physician in Greece said the problem was in the brain, not the soul. And the world took several centuries to decide whether to believe him. 800 years ago, a doctor in Baghdad said that conversation itself was medicine. 600 years ago, a hospital in Spain was giving patients structure and community and calling it treatment. And somewhere in all of that, often buried under the demonology and the spectacle and the chains, was the same instinct that has run through this entire story. Someone looked at a person whose mind was working in a way that frightened or confused or isolated them, and instead of turning away, they stayed. They tried. They built something, a ritual, a remedy, an institution, a theory, a conversation, out of the refusal to accept that nothing could be done. Modern psychiatry is extraordinary in ways no previous era could have imagined. Brain imaging, pharmacology, evidence-based therapy, the slow dismantling of stigma that still has a very long way to go. But the thing underneath it, the insistence that a suffering mind deserves attention and not just management, that the person inside the illness is still a person worth reaching, that has been true in fragments across the entire length of human history. We just keep having to rediscover it. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now?